The piercing wind tore at Laya Hart's woolen coat, each gust feeling like 1,000 minuscule blades as she drew her child closer. June's tiny hand clutched her mother's with a surprising firmness for someone only 6 years of age. In June's other arm, she held a cloth bundle that contained their entire earthly possessions. Behind them, the sprawling ranch house, Laya's home for the past 5 years, receded into the distance, a shrinking silhouette against the somber December sky. Wisps of smoke still curled from its chimney, a testament to the warmth and security that would now forever be beyond their reach. "Mama, where are we headed?" June's voice was a low murmur, softened by the scarf wrapped around her face, her breath creating ephemeral clouds in the frigid air. Laya offered no immediate reply. She possessed no ready answer, and the stark reality of that lack settled heavily in her stomach. The Harts, the parents of her late husband Samuel, had communicated their position with brutal finality. A widow with a child was a burden they were unwilling to shoulder, simply more mouths to feed without a man to provide the means. It mattered not that Laya had toiled on that ranch with the same vigor as any hired hand, that she could expertly rope, brand, and break horses. It mattered not that she had nursed old Mrs. Hart through a severe bout of pneumonia 2 winters prior, or that she had assisted in the delivery of 3 calves during the preceding spring's challenging season. Samuel had been gone for 3 months, a victim of a riding accident, a horse that had thrown him during what should have been a routine excursion. The Harts intended to grant their land to Samuel's younger brother and his new spouse. There was no provision for his widow and child in their future plans, regardless of how many years Laya had dedicated to the ranch. "Somewhere safe," Laya finally managed to say, though her heart pounded with a profound sense of trepidation. Tucked securely within the lining of her coat were $23, a hunting knife, a small cooking pot, a few essential provisions, and her husband's old rifle, accompanied by a meager quantity of ammunition. It was hardly a foundation upon which to build a future. They journeyed for 2 days through increasingly unforgiving terrain, seeking refuge at night under whatever meager shelter Laya could improvise, stretching their canvas tarp between rocks or low-hanging branches. The harsh winter of the Kansas Territory showed no mercy. On their first night, Laya managed to coax a small fire to life using their last remnants of dry kindling, and they huddled close to its meager warmth, consuming hard biscuits and jerky as the temperature steadily plummeted. She enveloped June in every spare piece of clothing they possessed, then held her daughter throughout the long, agonizing night, humming gentle lullabies to sustain her spirits. The second day brought a creeping weariness that made the ground treacherous. Laya's boots, thinned by years of ranch work, allowed water to seep in with every step. June's small shoes were in even worse condition, hand-me-downs that had never fit properly. By afternoon, both their feet were numb, and Laya knew they could not endure many more nights exposed to the elements. She attempted to project an air of optimism for June's sake, pointing out animal tracks in the snow and weaving tales about the passing landscapes, but privately, a gnawing terror consumed her. What had she been thinking? Should she have suppressed her pride, pleaded with the Harts for leniency, and agreed to work solely for room and board? Would servitude have been preferable to their current predicament? She had witnessed firsthand the Harts' treatment of their hired laborers, individuals with no alternative options. She would rather perish in freedom than endure such a life, and she was determined to spare June from that fate as well. On the third morning, as snow began to fall in earnest, Laya recognized the futility of their current path. A faint bluish tinge had appeared on June's lips, despite the scarf shielding her face, and the child's steps had become listless, her small body swaying with each movement. They desperately needed proper shelter and warmth, and they needed it within hours, not days. Laya forced down her rising panic and concentrated on the landscape unfolding before them. Limestone bluffs loomed ahead, resembling ancient sentinels, their gray faces streaked with darker mineral deposits and pockmarked with dark openings that, in the fading light, resembled vacant eye sockets. Laya had traversed this route before with Samuel, recalling his mention of caves within these hills that local trappers occasionally utilized. She had never felt the need to explore them. Until now. As the snow intensified, transforming the scenery into a blinding white panorama, those dark openings in the rock face appeared as a beacon of salvation. The first two caves offered crushing disappointment, shallow indentations in the cliff face, providing little more protection than a modest overhang. The third extended deeper, and Laya's hopes surged until she discovered the floor was damp, water seeping from fissures in the walls, and the ceiling so low that she had to stoop. Such an environment would be untenable. Laya felt a wave of despair washing over her, her hands trembling as she guided June along the base of the bluff. Then, rounding a bend, they found it. The entrance was wide enough to accommodate a wagon, partially concealed by a cascade of boulders that appeared to have fallen eons ago, creating a natural fortification. Stepping inside, beyond the reach of the biting wind, Laya immediately perceived a difference in the ambient temperature. It was not warm, but it was a welcome respite from the bone-chilling cold outside. The passage sloped downward for approximately 20 feet, the ceiling high enough for her to walk upright before opening into a space that compelled Laya to stop and gaze in disbelief. The chamber was immense, far surpassing the entirety of the Hart Ranch house in size. Her voice, when she called out experimentally, reverberated, the sound bouncing back from unseen walls. The ceiling soared at least 30 feet overhead, vanishing into shadow beyond the faint daylight filtering in from the entrance. But what truly captured her attention, igniting a flicker of desperate hope and bringing tears to her frost-chapped cheeks, was the sound of water. Not a mere drip or seep, but the gentle lapping of moving water against stone. "Stay here with the belongings, June," she instructed, though her daughter was already sinking against the wall, utterly overcome with exhaustion. With hands that trembled slightly, Laya managed to ignite their oil lantern, raising it high as she ventured deeper into the cave, each step carefully placed on the uneven ground. The pond lay in a natural depression within the cave floor, spanning perhaps 40 feet across and roughly oval in shape. The water was so crystalline that she could discern the rocky bottom even in the lantern's dim glow, observing the pale stones and dark crevices. She held her breath, barely daring to believe. Fish. Real fish. Several of them. Dark shapes glided lazily through the water. They were not large, but they were undeniably fish. And where there were some, there would undoubtedly be more. The pond must be replenished by an underground spring. The water was too clear, too fresh to be stagnant. Laya knelt at the edge and dipped her hand in. It was cold, certainly, but not icy, not frozen. A spring-fed pond, shielded by 30 feet of limestone and earth, protected from the harshest grip of winter's frost. Laya's mind raced with possibilities. The cave maintained a consistent temperature. She could already sense the difference from the biting cold outside, and they were 50 feet from the entrance. The entrance itself could be barricaded against wind and snow using their canvas and an assortment of gathered stones. There was water, fresh water, and where there was water and fish, there existed the potential for surviving the winter. More than just surviving, there was the possibility of genuinely living here until the arrival of spring, when they could formulate more concrete plans. "Mama," June's voice, laced with wonder, broke the silence. The child had followed, despite instructions to wait, and now stood pointing upwards, high above them. Daylight filtered through a natural shaft in the rock, a chimney that allowed in light and air but was far too narrow and elevated for the weather to pose a threat. The faint beam illuminated the mist rising from the pond, lending the cave an almost magical aura. "We are going to stay here," Laya declared, the decision solidifying as she spoke. "We are going to make this our home." The initial days presented the greatest challenges. Laya utilized their canvas tarp to construct a windbreak near the entrance, reinforcing it with piled stones. She ventured out only when absolutely necessary, gathering deadfall wood from the sparse vegetation along the bluff. The wind was relentless, and on 2 occasions she nearly lost her bearings in the driving snow, yet each excursion yielded precious fuel. Within the cave, she established their first fire in a cleared area away from the entrance, creating a hearth from flat stones. The smoke ascended naturally toward the high opening drawn by the draft. It was not a perfect system. At times, the wind shifted, causing smoke to eddy near the ceiling, but it functioned sufficiently. June contributed as best she could, her small hands meticulously arranging kindling and hauling the lighter pieces of wood. At night, they nestled together beneath every blanket and piece of clothing they possessed, listening to the wind's mournful howl outside as the fire burned low. On the fourth day, Laia fashioned a fishing line from thread carefully unraveled from her spare petticoat, weighting it with a small stone and baiting it with a sliver of salt pork from their dwindling provisions. She painstakingly carved a hook from a bone button, a laborious task that consumed hours. Her hands shook as she lowered it into the pond. June crouched beside her, her eyes wide with anticipation. When the line gave a distinct tug and Laia pulled up a fish, a respectable size, silvery and struggling, June let out a whoop that echoed through the cavernous space. That night, they feasted like royalty. The fish, roasted on flat stones beside the fire, marked the first time in days that Laia felt anything other than fear. However, she understood that a fire and a fishing line were insufficient. Winter was merely commencing, and they required more than mere survival. They needed a means to truly inhabit this place until spring's arrival. The notion occurred to her one night as she lay awake, listening to June's soft breathing. The cave's dry alcove, set back from the main chamber, had caught her eye days earlier. It was approximately 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide, with a floor that rose slightly above the main cave, ensuring its dryness. The challenge was to construct walls and a roof to create a tangible dwelling within the shelter of the cave. She lacked proper tools. What she possessed was an unyielding determination, knowledge gleaned from years of ranch work, and a daughter who depended on her. The acquisition of wood proceeded slowly, each piece a hard-won victory. On every clear day, Laia ventured out, sometimes making 3 or 4 trips before exhaustion compelled her to cease. She sought fallen trees, deadfall that had not succumbed to excessive rot, cottonwood, ash, whatever the bluffs offered. She refrained from cutting living trees, lacking a proper saw, and her knife, though sharp, was ill-suited for such endeavors. Yet nature, she discovered, was a generous provider if one knew where to look. She developed a system. First she would scout, identifying suitable wood. Then she would test its soundness. Rotten wood was useless, incapable of bearing any weight. Sound wood she would drag back to the cave entrance, a process that left her shoulders aching and her hands raw even through her gloves. The most arduous phase followed, wrestling the logs inside the cave, down the sloped entrance across the main floor, and into the alcove. June assisted by rolling the smaller pieces, her tiny hands pushing with all her might. The child never complained, though Laia could perceive the immense effort it cost her, the visible signs of her thinning frame despite the daily catch of fish. Both of them grew leaner, their clothing hanging looser, but they were surviving, and that was the paramount concern. Constructing the cabin frame demanded every iota of knowledge Laia had acquired from years of observing ranch hands build corrals, sheds, and line cabins. She longed desperately for Samuel's skill with wood, for his effortless proficiency with tools. But Samuel was gone, and she was alone. She employed notched joints to connect the logs, a technique she had witnessed but never executed herself. The initial attempts were disastrous. The notches were either too shallow or too deep, the logs rolling away or settling at awkward angles. Her hunting knife became an extension of her hand as she learned to carve the notches accurately, to judge angles and depths by sight and feel. Lacking proper nails or metal fasteners, she fashioned wooden pegs, sharpening them with painstaking care and hammering them into place with rocks. Her hands soon became raw and bleeding, despite the leather gloves she wore whenever feasible. She wrapped her damaged palms with strips torn from her petticoat, continuing her work. The walls rose slowly, log by agonizing log. Laia chinked the spaces between them with a mixture she developed through trial and error, clay dug from the pond's edge, combined with dried grass gathered before the worst snows arrived, and fish oil rendered from catches too small to consume whole. The mixture was messy to handle and emitted a foul odor when wet, but it dried hard and effectively sealed out drafts. For a roof, she initially used their canvas tarp, gradually replacing it with bark and smaller branches she collected, creating a pitched roof designed to shed any moisture that might seep from the cave ceiling above. The door was a simple frame covered with leather meticulously cut from her husband's old saddle, the sole possession of his she had managed to retain. She hung it with leather hinges and weighted the bottom with stones. It was not aesthetically pleasing, but it served its purpose. Inside, she constructed raised sleeping platforms using smaller logs and salvaged rope from their supplies, keeping them elevated from the ground and away from any dampness. She built a small hearth from flat stones, positioning it near the cabin's entrance, allowing smoke to escape through a gap she incorporated near the roofline. The flue was not perfect, but it drew adequately. By the time the coldest days of January arrived, the cabin stood complete. It was minuscule, barely 8 by 10 feet, but it was sturdy. Inside, with a fire burning in the small hearth and the door closed, the temperature was almost comfortable. The cave's stable climate, neither freezing nor overly warm, made a significant difference. Outside their cabin, within the main cave, it was cool but not life-threatening. Inside the cabin, it was genuinely livable. Laia crafted furniture from scraps and sheer ingenuity. A table fashioned from a flat piece of wood balanced on rocks, shelves constructed from smaller branches lashed together. She even managed a crude chair, though it wobbled alarmingly. June, however, deemed it the finest chair she had ever encountered. The pond became the focal point of their existence, their lifeline in the most profound sense. Laia fished daily, sometimes twice a day, her skill improving with each endeavor. She learned the fish's habits through patient observation, identifying where they fed in the mornings when the light from the high opening first illuminated the water, where they congregated in the afternoons, and how they responded to various baits. Her initial fishing line, fashioned from unpicked thread and weighted with a stone, was rudimentary yet functional. Over time, she refined her equipment. She fashioned a proper fishing rod from a flexible willow branch discovered near a stream outside the cave and learned to gauge the tension on the line by the rod's subtle movements. She created multiple hooks from various materials, including wire from her sewing kit, carefully shaped bone, and even a bent nail found lodged in a piece of driftwood. Different baits yielded varying results. The fish seemed to favor small pieces of their own kind, so Laia learned to save scraps from cleaning fish for bait. She also discovered they would readily take insects occasionally found within the cave and morsels from the rabbits she sometimes snared. June, too, learned, and observing her daughter's education in survival filled Laia with a complex mix of emotions. The child exhibited a patience that astounded Laia, capable of sitting for hours with the line, her gaze fixed on the water with the focused intensity of a born hunter. She learned to interpret subtle signs, the ripple that indicated a nearby fish, the distinct twitch of the line depending on whether it was the current or an actual bite. The day June caught her first fish independently, a respectable specimen nearly 8 inches long, Laia felt tears welling in her eyes. Her daughter was growing up in this cave, acquiring survival skills that no 6-year-old should ever need, yet she learned them with a grace and courage that would have made her father proud. They were no longer merely surviving. They were adapting, developing expertise, transforming into something entirely different from their former selves at the Hart Ranch. Laia fashioned tools from whatever she could find or create, each one a small triumph born of necessity and ingenuity. She had brought her sewing kit, a tin box containing needles, thread, buttons, and a small pair of scissors. With these, she constantly repaired their clothing, reinforced weak spots before they became holes, and even fashioned a warmer vest for June from scraps of their old blankets, combined with rabbit fur from her successful snares. When her metal needles broke, she learned to carve wooden ones from small, straight twigs, smoothing them endlessly with her knife until they could pass through fabric. She created thread from plant fibers gathered during brief forays outside, from unraveled cloth, from anything that could be twisted into something resembling string. None of it matched the quality of store-bought thread, but it held seams together, and that was sufficient. She fashioned a crude but effective fish scaler from a flat piece of flint she discovered and learned to clean fish with minimal waste. The bones she saved, boiling them to extract every last bit of nutrition and utilizing the remaining bones for tools, needles, hooks, and even small scrapers for working leather. Water was never an issue. The pond provided all they needed and more. However, Laia learned early on, after a bout of stomach sickness that terrified her to her core, to boil all their drinking water first. She had no means to treat serious illness out here, no doctor within miles, even if they could afford one. Prevention was paramount, and she became fanatical about it. Every cup of water was boiled, every morsel of food was cooked thoroughly. Their hands were washed before eating, though soap was a luxury they could not afford to squander. Food management evolved into a science. The fish were a reliable source, but not inexhaustible. Laia never took more than 3 or 4 per day, exercising caution to avoid depleting their sole consistent food source. She rationed their remaining provisions with meticulous precision. Flour, salt, the small amount of coffee she saved for the coldest mornings when their spirits most needed lifting. The snare she set near the cave entrance yielded occasional success. Rabbits or squirrels, precious additions to their diet that June greeted with genuine excitement each time. Laia taught her daughter how to skin and clean small game, skills she had acquired as a girl growing up on the frontier. June approached these lessons with the same focused intensity she brought to fishing, and Laia watched her daughter's capable hands at work with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. She endeavored to vary their meals as best she could. Fish roasted on stones, fish boiled in their single pot, fish smoked over the fire on a rack she constructed from green willow branches. She prepared a type of porridge from their dwindling flour, flavored with rendered fish fat and wild onions she discovered growing in a sheltered spot outside. February brought the most severe storms. For days on end they were confined indoors. The wind shrieked across the bluff, and snow piled high against their canvas windbreak. But inside the cabin, inside the cave, they were safe and relatively warm. June was undergoing a transformation. The frightened child who had departed the Heart Ranch was evolving into someone different. Perhaps harder, but undeniably more self-assured. She could fish, tend the fire, and prepare food without explicit instruction. She entertained herself with stones from the cave, devising elaborate games that Laia only partially comprehended. In the evenings by the firelight, Laia told stories, tales from her own childhood, stories her mother had shared with her. She taught June her letters, scratching them into the dirt floor with a stick. They sang songs, their voices echoing strangely within the cave chamber. Laia observed her daughter, experiencing a profound sense of both pride and sorrow. This existence was not the upbringing June had anticipated, yet the child possessed a remarkable resilience, learning to navigate adversity without succumbing. This inherent strength held significant value. The pivotal moment arrived in early March, during what Laia fervently hoped was winter's final defiant act. She had departed to inspect her traps, leaving June within the cabin under strict orders to remain put. The wind bit fiercely, but the heavens above remained clear, and Laia's spirits were buoyed by the impending arrival of spring. Perhaps an hour had elapsed when a sound reached her ears, a sharp crack, akin to thunder, followed by a deafening, tumbling roar. Her heart constricted with fear. Abandoning the rabbit she had secured, she raced towards the cave, her sole focus on June. At the cave's maw, she halted abruptly. A portion of the cavern's ceiling, close to the entrance, had crumbled. While not a complete devastation, it was sufficient to partially obstruct their egress with fallen debris and to churn up a choking cloud of dust that made respiration arduous. The fabric windbreak lay in tatters, and snow now swirled directly into their sanctuary. "June!" Her voice, strained with panic, broke. "Mama!" The response echoed from the cave's interior, nearer to their makeshift dwelling. "Thank heavens," Laia breathed. She pushed through the blinding dust and dislodged rocks. June stood framed in the cabin doorway, her eyes wide but betraying no outward panic. The rockfall had occurred distant enough from their shelter that they faced no immediate peril. Nevertheless, the predicament was grave. The entryway was partly impassable, their protective screen destroyed, and most disturbingly, the upheaval had so thoroughly contaminated the air with particulate matter that breathing within the cave became exceedingly difficult. However, Laia had cultivated the ability to think with stark clarity amidst turmoil. Necessity had drilled this skill into her over the preceding months. Her initial action was to guide June into the cabin and secure the door, thereby minimizing their inhalation of dust. Subsequently, she meticulously assessed the damage. Ironically, the collapse had inadvertently erected a novel form of windbreak. A mound of stones now partially deflected the harshest gusts, but they still needed to fortify the entrance more effectively. Working with swift efficiency, she retrieved the tattered canvas and fashioned a new barrier. This was strategically placed behind the newly formed rockfall, utilizing the dislodged stones as anchors. She toiled until her hands were raw and bleeding until the wind's intrusive force was significantly diminished. The pervasive dust took several days to fully settle. They remained largely confined to the cabin, breathing through makeshift cloth masks and maintaining a low fire to limit smoke production. It was an ordeal, fraught with fear and discomfort, yet they persevered. Once the air finally cleared, Laia examined the elevated opening that served as their source of ventilation and natural light. Miraculously, it appeared unharmed. The cave's structural integrity remained sound, merely altered in its configuration. In a peculiar twist, the geological event had, in fact, subtly improved their circumstances. The newly formed rock barrier at the entrance offered superior protection compared to the canvas. The cave now felt more shielded, more secure against the elements. As March progressed, nascent signs of spring began to manifest. The wind relinquished its most cutting edge. Icicles clinging to the cave's facade commenced their daily descent. The pond's inhabitants grew more animated, presenting more accessible opportunities for sustenance. Laia gradually ventured further from the cave's immediate vicinity, exploring the surrounding terrain. She discovered the first sprouts of wild greens, which she gathered with eagerness. She located a stream fed by snowmelt and followed its course to a sheltered valley where early wildflowers were beginning to unfurl their petals. One afternoon, her gaze fell upon discernible wagon tracks etched into a distant ridgeline, a tangible indication of human passage, the first she had encountered since discovering their refuge. The sight evoked a complex tapestry of emotions within her. They had weathered their ordeal in isolation, she and June. They had carved out an existence within this cave through sheer determination and resourcefulness. A profound sense of pride welled within her. Yet, she understood they could not remain here indefinitely. June required more than this cavern could offer: educational opportunities, companionship with peers, a genuine future, and Laia herself. Laia also needed to secure employment and establish a more enduring foundation for their lives. Nevertheless, there was no immediate urgency. Spring was in its infancy. They possessed provisions, shelter, and a sense of security. They could afford to proceed deliberately, formulating their strategies and preparing themselves thoroughly. Back in the cabin that evening, Laia observed June meticulously tending to their fishing implements, readying them for the following day's excursion. The child's movements were precise and practiced. June had developed a proficiency that both ached Laia's heart and filled it with immense pride. "Mama?" June looked up. "May we stay here a little longer, even when the weather turns warm?" Laia felt a tightness in her throat. "Why do you ask?" June offered a shrug, a gesture that appeared unexpectedly mature. "I find this place agreeable. I cherish these moments when it's solely us. I appreciate that we constructed this haven ourselves." Laia drew her daughter into a close embrace. "We shall remain for as long as it's necessary. But June, there is an entire world awaiting you. You ought to experience it." "I understand," June replied softly. "But not just yet. Not yet. Not yet," Laia concurred. That night, as a spring tempest buffeted the canvas at the entrance, yet failed to penetrate their cozy cabin, Laia lay awake, her thoughts consumed by the future. They would eventually need to locate a settlement, secure employment, and ensure June's schooling. However, they would also need to carry something invaluable with them: the profound understanding that they could surmount any challenge, that their inherent strength far surpassed their previous perception. The circumstances had cast them out, abandoned them to the biting winter cold. Yet they had not merely endured. They had, in their own fashion, flourished. They had forged a home from virtually nothing, discovering abundance where others might have perceived only rock and shadow. The gentle murmur of the pond drifted through the cabin door, which Laia had left ajar, sensing the amelioration of the weather. The occasional splash of fish broke the quiet, and from somewhere high above, nocturnal birds offered their calls. Laia's thoughts turned to the day they had successfully landed their first substantial fish together, recalling the unadulterated joy that had illuminated June's face. She contemplated all the subsequent minor triumphs: the inaugural night spent in their completed cabin, their first successful capture of a rabbit, the occasion they had shared an uncontrollable fit of laughter over a wobbly chair, continuing for a full 10 minutes. This cave had provided a sanctuary when they possessed nothing else. It had transformed into a place of learning, a proving ground, a dwelling. Whatever lay ahead, wherever their path might lead, they would carry this period of their lives with them. Spring would eventually arrive in its full glory. The pond would warm, the fish would spawn, and wildflowers would blossom beyond the cave's threshold. And when they were entirely ready, truly prepared, they would step forth into that wider world, imbued with greater resilience and capability than ever before. But that was a prospect for a later time. For the present, there was this: a warm cabin nestled within a cave, a daughter slumbering peacefully, a contented stomach, and the profound knowledge that they had survived. Not merely survived, but discovered a means to live with both dignity and even joy amidst their considerable hardships. Outside, the storm subsided, and moonlight filtered through the high aperture in the cave's roof, casting ethereal silver patterns upon the pond's dark expanse. Within the confines of the tiny cabin, Laia finally succumbed to sleep, one hand resting gently on June's shoulder, both of them safe, whole, and at peace.